Well, welcome everybody. We want to welcome everyone and good afternoon. Welcome to RV Rapids Transit Talk. This is a monthly webinar series where we give you information that's happening and taking place in public transportation around the region. My name is Faith Walker. I'm the Executive Director for RV Rapid Transit. As many of you know, we are dedicated to advocating and organizing for frequent and far-reaching public transportation in the Richmond region. And we want to do that in three ways. We want to see buses go more places, people to have dignified places to wait for the bus. And then last but not least, we want to elevate riders' voices in transit planning and decision-making. So today, before we get started, I want to give it over to Richard. And again, before I do that, I also want to give some housekeeping notes. Housekeeping, if you guys can just please make sure you keep yourselves on mute throughout the entire transit talk today. We will be recording. And then also too, I also want to make sure we say thank you to our community partners, Bon Secours, the Community Foundation, the Energy Foundation, the Virginia Walkability Action Institute, and you. You being on this call today, supporting the work we do, we greatly appreciate it. So with that, Richard, please introduce yourself and give us some transit news.
Awesome. Well, welcome everybody. Thank you so much for being here. I'm the Richard Hankins, the Programs and Communications Manager for RV Rapid Transit. So I do the social media newsletter and then the Better Bus Stop program. So I know we have at least one adopter here. Thank you so much, Danini. And if you guys ever want to adopt a stop, help us keep our bus stops clean. You can go on our website, rvarapidtransit.org. And now just for a bit of news. So there's been some great news coming from the bipartisan infrastructure bill passed last year. GRTC got a whopping $11 million. It's going to allow them to replace 19 of their older diesel buses with more sustainable natural gas. There's a typo there. That was $10 million. And then they're getting an extra $1 million to expand their bus storage capacity. And that's exciting because it's preparing them not only for the present, but for future transit expansions when they'll need more buses. And then we've had a really fun time in the community the last few weeks. We did tabling and canvassing at Broad and 4th, which is a really popular bus stop. We had a couple of volunteers, Odessa and Stage, and then one of our partners, El de la Cancela from Chesapeake Climate Action Network. And we were promoting Mobility University, which you'll learn about on the next slide. And then Faith and I had a ball at the second annual Churchill Gospel Fest, and we were explaining to people our mission, our goals, and tapping into the community. And it was honestly just a really fun day. If you guys see, we have these really cool banners. That was thanks to a generous donation to really help us get our word out. And if you want to join in and help us with that, you can go to rvrapidtransit.org/donate. And then just a little bit of self-promotion. We got a pro-bus article in Richmond Magazine with some great art. And so we're really happy to be getting the voice of getting more bus news into the Richmond ecosphere, just to raise awareness and raise action for public transportation. And then this is going to be a little promo video about our inaugural Mobility University, where folks can learn to advocate for transit. Faith put together this wonderful little promo video that I'll play, and then she'll just talk a little bit more about it in her words.
Calling all bus riders in the Richmond region. Want more buses going more places? Want dignified places to wait when headed to work? Want to know how your voice can be heard in transit planning and decision making? Well, enroll in Mobility University, a 5-week intensive course that will teach you how to transform public transportation in RVA and empower you to share your story with decision makers. Take action now and apply. Classes begin every Wednesday starting September 7th from 5:30 to 8 p.m. at the main branch Richmond Public Library, located at 101 East Franklin Street. Dinner will be catered all 5 weeks by the delicious Soul and Vinegar, a small neighborhood food shop offering diverse foods for diverse people. Now you can visit tinyurl.com/Mobility University, or you can text 804-286-0007 for more information. RVA's long history of prejudice and racism has led to a fractured and limited public transportation system. Persons of color, persons with disability, or from any other marginalized community are strongly encouraged to apply. Mobility University was created in partnership with RVA Rapid Transit and the Chesapeake Climate Action Network.
Did you have anything you wanted to add about it, Faye?
No, that was great. Thank you so much for sharing that. We are accepting applications right now as we speak. So if this is something that speaks to you, or you know someone who is a bus rider and looking for ways to learn how to self-advocate, or even to share their story or learn how to do so, we please encourage them to apply for Mobility University that is starting September 7th. So we have less than about 3 weeks before that gets started. So we're looking forward to that. So you're all set?
Yeah,
All right.
thanks so much.
I guess that's my cue to give it on back to me. What I wanted to do right now is share with you writers' voice. Again, our goal and our mission is to elevate writers' voices in decision-making and planning. And this was an opportunity that I had last year to interview this young lady. She didn't want to leave her name, but this summer, Jeremy and myself, who will be speaking later on, we wanted to go out and take thermal photos of different bus stops and to measure how hot it is. And as you can see with this photo here, this is at Broad and 11th Street. And there are some recordings of some heat temperatures here. Number one is registering at 103, that's the street. The person themselves is registering around 91 degrees. And then the concrete right beside them where someone would stand is registering at 101. When I asked the woman at the bus stop, hey, what it would be like or feel like to have a shelter at this stop, we did not know that GRTC was going to be installing a bus stop in FY23. And so good news, this stop will be installed sometime between July of this year and July of next year, which is great news. But we wanted to capture how hot it is currently. And then also what we'll be doing is taking pictures of the stop once a shelter does arrive and see the different exposure. But I'd love to share with you what she said about having a shelter at that particular stop. So we'll play it right now. So can you tell me what lines you take?
I take the 7A, 7B, the 91, and the Pulse on the regular.
And can you tell me a little bit about this stop and why you think it's important that it should have a shelter?
As you can see, it's pretty hot out here. A lot of days, the sun is extremely hot, and like now I'm over here in the shade trying to keep a little cool, a little warm. But I'm also, when it's snowing or raining, it would be good to have a shelter to cover you at least. I think would be good, and then we will be moving this area also, where we'll be in a safe area, where we're protected from the sun, or from the rain, or from the snow, or the sleet, or what have you. But I think it would be great to have that, yes.
And what I wanted to do is show you a regular photo of this stop. So I'm pretty sure some of you have passed it. And so this is in front of the Supreme Court of Appeals building. And generally where her and I were standing to get out of the sun was back in that foyer area where the cursor is right now. And so generally a lot of people, when it's hot or it's raining, they tend to gather in the foyer of that court appeals building. So it's good news to see that a shelter will be installed within the next year at this location. So with that, I definitely want to turn it over to our guest speaker today. Let me introduce you to Dr. Jeremy Hoffman. He was born and raised in the heart of the Midwest, and these days he can be found biking all around Richmond, Pocahontas State Park, as well as by the James. Jeremy graduated summa cum laude with a distinction in geology from the Augustana College in Rock Island, Illinois. Then he earned his PhD in geology with a focus in paleoclimatology at Oregon State University. He is now chief scientist for the Science Museum of Virginia and currently teaches physical geography for the Urban and Regional Studies program for the Douglas Wilder of Government Public Affairs at VCU. Jeremy regularly engages with audiences like he is today of all ages and backgrounds to explore climate change and how it works on multiple timescales from human to geologic. And he also was recently a co-lead and co-principal lead investigator for urban heat island studies in Richmond, Virginia, Washington, D.C., as well as Baltimore. So with that, I'll turn it over to you, Jeremy. Take it away.
Thanks so much, Faith and Richard, for the invitation to come and talk about this. I was thinking before this talk, it's so much of what I like to do at the Science Museum of Virginia is to connect new audiences to how climate change overlaps with parts of their life. And so this is a really exciting opportunity for me to get to learn more in the world of how transit and climate change overlaps. And we're going to talk today a little bit about, how transit fits into the broader context of climate change, and then get into that the idea around extreme heat and exposure to the elements as one is being a rider on the transit system that we have here in Richmond, Virginia. So I'm the David and Jane Cohn scientist at the Science Museum. You can find me a lot of the times on social media. I talk about a whole range of different things, but coming up in the next few months, I'll be advertising public comment opportunities for the 5th National Climate Assessment, which I'm serving as the chapter lead for the Southeast Regional Chapter for the 5th National Climate Assessment. So again, thanks for coming and for participating in this conversation. I'll quickly introduce myself. You heard Faith say that I like to ride bikes. I also have some embarrassing childhood photos to show you. Beyond having an impeccable sense of fashion over the course of my life and hairstyles and all of that, is that I consider myself someone that really enjoys the outdoors. So I'm a huge cyclist now, both commuter and for exercise, but I also still go fishing with my dad in northwestern Wisconsin every single year, or as much as I can, given the state of the pandemic over the last few years. And climate change dramatically threatens that identity. And I think, over the course of my lifetime, the likelihood of catching a particular type of fish known as a walleye, which is really tasty and yummy. And I remember my dad making it with eggs in the morning when we'd be on vacation there. Climate change really threatens the opportunity to share that same experience with people in the future. So like my 1-year-old niece, Riley, may not be able to have that same kind of tradition and identity around outdoor spaces because of the threats of climate change. And so I just wanted to kind of give you some context as to who I am and why it is that I do what I do. Partially from the scientific standpoint, I find the climate system to be exceptionally interesting, but I also find that it's something that the threats of climate change really put things into perspective as like a multi-generational reason to get activated in the space. So what is exactly climate change? Again, many of you have heard about this, but global warming has been going on. It's advancing every single year. We've seen about a degree of Celsius, around a degree Celsius warming over the last 150 years or so, but most of that occurring in just the last 30 or so years. This is really the fastest rate of warming that we've seen during the entirety of human civilization. And you can see it pretty dramatically when we represent it as colors. So here on this chart from left to right are years as bars, and each year is colored from blue to red, depending on whether it was cooler than average, than the 20th century average temperature that year, or warmer than average, which would give it a red color. And you can see the kind of concentration of red here identifies just how weird and unique the last couple decades have been with respect to pretty much the entirety of modern human civilization. Now, you'd have to be over 33 or 34 years old to have lived on the Earth the last time monthly global average temperature was below the 20th century average. So basically anyone in their early 30s and younger has lived in a climate changed world for their entire life. And so that gives a little bit of context to the rapidity of these changes for climate change and the necessity for us to act urgently in response. And we have a global climate report called the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change Assessment Report, or AR, and the 6th assessment report just came out in the last 2 years. And one of those focuses on the question, like, what will it take globally to stop climate change? And they break that question down into a variety of different sectors, things like agriculture or energy. And then one unique chapter that I found very appropriate for this discussion is cities. There is a majority of human civilization is now concentrated, or the human population is concentrated in cities. That's expected to only continue to grow into the middle part of the century and towards the end of the century. And so in order to make cities a climate change reducing settlement, it requires denser housing, so taller and smaller, or denser housing in the sense of taller and more units in a smaller area, fewer cars, which is directly related to increasing the availability, reliability, and frequency of public transportation, and more efficient energy systems. And so when we think about what that looks like kind of as a step here, so if we imagine an urban area broken down into those things, energy in the form of renewables, and other forms of low carbon energy running all of the electrical systems in almost total abandonment of things like natural gas, and coal, oil, and gas, any of the fossil fuel related sources of energy. Buildings, this is where we can get into efficiency. We can talk about buildings being net zero, or LEED gold or LEED platinum, that sort of thing. And then again, more dense housing availability in our urban areas. Transportation needs to be dramatically rethought of in our cities, especially in American cities, with focusing on active and public transportation. And then land use that makes use, or that doesn't expand car-centric sprawl on the exterior of cities, which actually exposes more people to the threats of climate change over a wider area. Think about like a Hurricane Harvey in Houston, for example. The sprawling development pattern of Houston makes it exceptionally uniquely at risk for things like a hurricane, which dumps a bunch of water on that sprawling land use and causes it to flood much more seriously than it would otherwise. But when we look at the types of transportation related things that we can be doing, this is how public transportation fits into the equation. Among all of the transport related recommendations in this global climate report, shifting to public transportation was among the top strategies for reducing heat trapping gas emissions, which ultimately drive climate change. Shifting to public transportation had about as large of an impact as efficiency and optimization in shipping, and even electric light duty vehicles, which you've heard are going to receive a massive investment as part of the Inflation Reduction Act that was just signed by President Biden and passed by Congress. So the shifting to public transportation has the potential to dramatically reducing the heat trapping gas emissions in urban areas. And that's not just in a place like Richmond, that would be including all of those counties that ring around our area. So in a sense, at this big global level, and the ways that we can work towards effective climate action is that public transportation is key to achieving our emissions reduction goals, especially here at a more local level. In Virginia, the #1 source of heat trapping gases from Virginia as a state is our transportation system. And a majority, close to 70% of those emissions from our transportation sector are from single occupancy vehicles. So our biggest low-hanging fruit for reducing heat trapping gas emissions comes from addressing the car-centric land use and dependence on cars in our state. So that's how, at least at this big level, #1 is that public transportation like GRTC and all the public transit agencies in Virginia are among the key ways that we can achieve emissions reduction goals in sectors that drastically need it. Now, when we think about the actual impacts of climate change on our society, on where we live, we can look to the National Climate Assessment, where Virginia falls into the southeast region, but really the mid-Atlantic, where we live, kind of straddles the southeast and northeast sector or regions of the United States. And so what's funny about these big, massive climate assessments is that most of the time they can be distilled down to very simple messages in the form of emojis. Climate change in our region basically means that we need to be preparing for a hotter, wetter, sneezier, and wheezier climate. Now, we're going to talk a lot about hotter, but wetter is interesting because we tend to hear, especially if you're, in Virginia, we hear a lot about sea level rise. In Norfolk and in the places along coastal Virginia, they have the fastest rates of sea level rise of any place on the east coast of North America. So that's one thing. We've got the ocean kind of encroaching on the coast through time. And several studies, which I've co-authored or been a part of, have shown that here in Virginia and around the mid-Atlantic, we have increasing intensity of our rainiest events. So we have more of these really substantial rainfall events, and they're happening over a shorter time period. What does that do? That drops more water in a shorter amount of time. That creates flashier floods, like the ones that we've just seen happening in places in Kentucky and Tennessee, and even far southwestern Virginia as well in the last couple of years. Now, sneezier and wheezier is kind of a complicated. You might be like, why would climate change make us sneezier and wheezier? Well, the long-term warming of the climate system actually lengthens and strengthens our pollen season. So here in Richmond, for example, we've been able to show that the peak pollen that we see every single spring, that day that's like super yellow dust all over your car and all over your bike or all over your house, that has gotten more intense and happening earlier into the spring. Wheezier in the sense that our air quality, although we are living in the best air quality in Virginia's monitored history, there are still threats to our climate or to our air quality from long traveled wildfire smoke. Last summer, we saw wildfire smoke from California and Canada's wildfires that was moving in a river of air that descended into our region and caused some of the worst air quality in the last 15 years here in Richmond, Virginia, and across the Northeast. So climate change is a really multifaceted issue, and most of the time, these climate impacts can be directly related to our public health. And in fact, getting back to that question of hotter, extreme heat kills more people nationwide than any other climate-related hazard. So even when you're thinking about things like floods or tornadoes or hurricanes, which tend to make it on the news, we can watch them play out from satellite imagery, especially hurricanes. We tend to, right now we're in hurricane season. It's been kind of a quiet year so far, but hurricanes, we watch, the satellite images of them spinning around, and we know that they're going to make landfall in a few days. Extreme heat is really difficult to describe in that same way. Extreme heat is really nefarious in the sense that it everywhere has different thresholds for what people even consider to be hot. Here we live in Virginia, where we're used to walking around outside in what feels like someone else's mouth in the middle of July. But that is a a very acute threat to public health. And most of the time we learn about these acute risks as that heat pose through disasters in big cities. This is a picture from the city of Chicago, Illinois, in July 1995, where we learned that, several days at 110 degrees Fahrenheit, overnight temperatures not getting below 80. A lot of people died. Almost 800 people, depending on the estimate, died during this several-day heat wave in the weekend in July in 1995. And by looking at that number, you don't have any idea about where these folks lived or who they were really. And when sociologist Eric Kleinenberg separated those things, it was clear that elderly members of communities of color were disproportionately dying during this heat wave, and especially in those neighborhoods on the south and west sides of the city that had felt the impacts of generational disinvestment and marginalization through urban planning policy. So we know that especially, and just this last summer in 2021, the city of Portland, Oregon, and Seattle and British Columbia, the same patterns played out. Elderly members of communities of color were dying at a higher rate than other folks during the especially wealthier and wider communities during the heat wave, that the heat dome that went over Portland in the Pacific Northwest last summer. So we know that what's interesting, it's been 25 years since Chicago, it's been 1 year since Portland, and there still hasn't been a lot of action to protect individuals from these communities from these impacts. And here in Virginia, that is actually something that we should be extremely concerned about. Just a couple days ago, the First Street Foundation released a report about the future of extreme heat. I was a co-author on this original paper and a consulting academic on the report, showing that the number of consecutive days of 100 degrees feels like temperature. So these are the extremely dangerous temperatures when hundreds of Virginians can get sick due to heat-related illnesses. That by 2050, we might be experiencing 5 or more additional days above 100 degrees Fahrenheit in this region. So we just went through a series of days that were maybe 6 or 7, I think, was the stretch where temperatures were hovering right around 100 degrees in July, at the end of July. And if you add an additional week of that again, I mean, think about not only the public health implications, but things like for our energy bills, for how we cool down spaces. All of these future threats due to climate change, in the sense of intensifying heat seasons, are complicated for our public health, as well as other things. Infrastructure struggles when we have extreme temperatures. It can be damaging to roads and rail infrastructure. And it can be especially damaging to the electrical grid, which is already quite taxed in the present climate. If you add an additional number of units of air conditioning and other forms of cooling, putting that stress and strain on the electrical grid, there tends to be a risk of rolling blackouts during these exceptionally hot and long events. Now, we also know that extreme heat doesn't act the same way everywhere. So this is a chance for you to participate. People that are on the call, get ready to in the chat, get your chat ready. And what we're going to do is pretend like we're in the Magic School Bus, and I'm Miss Frizzle, and I'm giving you the assignment to go find the hottest spot to the touch. And you're going to write in the chat on 3. On 3, you're going to put in the chat where you're going to go to find the hottest spot in this picture. Okay, 1, 2, 3. Type it into the chat. There we go. We get some answers. Awesome. Participate. I love that. Okay, we've got a pretty good consensus here. All right, so mostly having to do with the types of like built environment. We're talking about the surfaces. Now, what about the coolest spot to the touch on 3? Get ready to type where you're going to go to the coolest spot on 3. 1, 2, 3. There we go. Okay, we've got a couple interesting answers here. Shade tends to be the consensus. Well, that's great. So what's awesome is that we have this kind of, you have this hypothesis that's actually really testable. And what's great about science is that we have so many tools in front of us that allow us to actually investigate your hypothesis. Now, this is what we can do is use a thermal camera, which sees infrared energy, or basically just heat energy, coming back off of all of these surfaces. And by coloring them by their temperatures, we're able to see exactly which surfaces are the warmest and where the coolest spots are. So let's see, this is a FLIR camera that I use that attaches to my phone, and we can take pictures. It's actually the same technology that Faith shared in that photo of the bus stop at Broad and 11th. And here we can see that the hottest surface, but indeed, is the asphalt, especially this particularly dense asphalt here by the Moonkugel. And then our coolest spot is by far under the big mature oak tree. But everything in between is really interesting as well. So you've got the extremes, and then there's a bunch of stuff in between that, like the colors of the cars. Even though all the cars are basically made out of the same material, that color directly corresponds to their reflectivity to the sun's energy, or something called the albedo of that surface. And so just having a lighter color on your car can drastically reduce the temperatures that you feel on the car and then also inside. This could be applied directly to the types of buildings that we build, as well as the types of what kind of color of things would we use for, say, providing a shade structure or something like that. Now, also on this is the type of vegetation is very important. So we've got younger trees that have less shade capacity than the big oak trees. So that means we need to be preserving where we have very old big trees. We need to be taking care of those especially, and not allowing them to be, cut down or removed as part of increasing our housing density. They do not have to be in opposition whatsoever. In fact, they can be additive. Now, also at the same time, these non-native grasses that you see, the kind of lawn that everyone has in front of, big, might be in your front yard, or what lawn looks like. Well, that can be as hot as the sidewalk when it's, desiccated and very dry in the middle of a drought. Meanwhile, the native plants, kind of native to Central Virginia, those plants have much deeper tap roots, which allow them to draw groundwater up and then transpire that, or basically evaporate it like plant sweat into the surrounding air, giving them a relatively cool temperature relative to the non-native grasses. So we can use this one picture to tell us a lot about the way heat would be worse in some places and ameliorated in others based on your hypothesis. So when you think about Richmond, or you think about the city that you're calling in from, and you think about places that might have more of those asphalt surfaces or more of those big mature trees, where are those and who lives in those places? In July 2017, we went out and actually tried and measured the air temperature in our city during a heat wave. We also followed this up last year among 10 other cities in Virginia and dozens of cities around the country participating in this research now. But we teamed up with local nonprofit Groundwork RVA, as well as the Richmond Times-Dispatch, and the couple of the universities in town to measure the city's temperature. And basically these like what would be a car flag, you could put like a commander's flag or something on there, but it's really the science, car flag of science. Basically measures the air temperature that's going through that little hole in the top of the PVC pipe here. And by comparing that to our GPS unit, which is keeping track of where we are, we can map out in very high detail how temperatures vary across the built environment in our cities. And here in Richmond, I rode my bike around like a very irresponsibly, exerting myself during a heat wave in July, and I experienced a 16-degree Fahrenheit difference between the coolest and warmest place at the exact same during the same hour. Many of the warmest places that I experienced were very wide streets, places like Arthur Ashe Boulevard near Broad Street, very wide streets, very low buildings. The coolest places were the places that had the most dense shade canopy, places like Dogwood Dell. And then even some of the other cooler places were actually in the shade canyons cast by the very tall buildings downtown. So this actually aids in our interpretation of that housing density that actually could end up cooling our city during the hottest time of the day, simply by casting more shadows on those streets. It's a principle known as the height to width ratio, where if you have taller buildings than you have wide streets, that will cast shadows on those spaces and actually cool the air down. It can trap air pollution, so there's considerations about remaining a bunch of different types of heights of buildings to maximize the turbulence of the air. Nevertheless, let's continue on. I could always talk about this for many, many hours, but this is what the pattern looks like across Richmond, that 16-degree difference between the coolest and warmest place. Many of those landscapes that are wide streets, short buildings were the hottest places. Scott's Addition, Manchester, the Diamond, parts of Brooklyn Park Boulevard, and in many of the major corridors, at like the all the different kind of surface highways through the south side of the city. And then many of the coolest places had the highest amount of tree canopy, mostly in the western part of the city. Now, you might ask, like, well, you talked about this being a public health issue. Well, if we look at that extreme heat map next to a map of where the ambulance goes to respond to heat-related illnesses the most. So again, this is a map of where the ambulance goes for heat-related illnesses. We see that those maps overlap quite closely, as well as even if you correct the map of ambulance responses for the density of people that live there, this relationship still exists. We're working on this for a publication right now with researchers at the University of Richmond. Now, again, like I said before, if you don't disaggregate this, we know where those people are, where those trends are, but who it is. If we don't talk about that, we might miss something really important. In this case, the fact that 60% of our heat-related illness response cases are for Black individuals in the city of Richmond, but that is an over-representation of that community in these numbers. So this is a clear environmental justice issue here in Richmond, where there's a higher rate of cases experienced by a population that is actually equal or roughly equal to the white population in the city, which is underrepresented. So this is a disproportionate impact on the Black community in Richmond. And this turns out has its roots in a urban planning policy, just like what we talked about in Chicago, where if you haven't heard about the redlining map, I don't have a lot of time to get into this conversation right now, but basically it was a way of based on the color of the skin and the immigrant status of the people living in particular neighborhoods, to draw a red polygon around where they lived and deny those areas wholesale access to financial wealth building strategies like home mortgages and homeowners insurance. It turns out that this also has a long-term impact on the built environment in Richmond and other places. These maps appeared in the New York Times in August 2020, showing that the formerly redlined neighborhoods in Richmond, some of which are some really famous historical Black neighborhoods like Jackson Ward, are significantly warmer than their non-redlined, wealthier and whiter neighborhood counterparts in the West End, like Windsor Farms and Westover Hills. At the same time, those places, you might be thinking, based on a hypothesis you made yourselves, is that these places are dominated by these paved surfaces and have very many fewer trees. So when we think about, like, what could we do to just address this urban heat island effect, there comes down to a couple different strategies, like mitigation, or actually physically turning down the temperature through things like reducing the built environment's contribution to urban heat, things like trees, shade structures. But there's also, on the opposite side, how we prepare and respond to the chronic acute heat risk. That's really how we achieve this kind of heat and climate resilient community that we're all seeking. And this comes in a lot of different ways. And the key one here that I want to focus on is exactly what you might think are these shade structures. So let's get into a little bit about that in just a second. But I'm gonna go through what makes this in a particularly interesting here in Richmond. talking about transit. Let's bring this heat question back to transit. So if we look at roughly the redlining map and what present day patterns of car access looks like in Richmond, we see that actually, much like the legacy of this redlining playing out in the built environment socioeconomically, it also plays out in the percent of households without a vehicle, where the greener parts of this map are the places that have less access to a vehicle. So this breaks down also along racial lines, where the Black community and people of color in Richmond have much higher rates of access without access to a vehicle as of 2019. And many fewer white people in that, much lower than the overall pattern in Richmond. So people in hotter areas rely then on public transportation. How is it that we get to the bus stop? Well, then you have to walk or ride your bike. And we have been doing some research with UVA on this very topic, sending people out into the built environment to assess how that affects people's stress levels when they go between the walking back and forth along a path that looks like the left side or like the right side. Perhaps unsurprisingly, that busy walk down Broad Street had much higher levels of PM 2.5 or a pollutant in the air. You're much closer to busy roads, so you're getting the direct emissions from cars' tailpipes, as well as their tire wear, as well as the dust being kicked up on the road, versus those calmer, greener walks. Also, that busier road, it was much hotter. As you know, those are areas without a lot of shade and a lot of heat trapping kinds of surfaces. Now, also, these same busier roads are very dangerous. That's actually much of those roads to get along our major corridors are part of the high injury network here in Richmond. And even if we distill that down into where pedestrians tend to have pedestrian related crashes presented in the Richmond Vision Zero plan, we see that many of these places that are also very hot also tend to have these other things, either high injuries or elevated numbers of pedestrian crashes. So it is less comfortable and more dangerous to walk along these major traffic corridors. So when you get to the bus stop, when if you're relying on the transportation system, you walk through these dangerous roads, these hot, less comfortable, dangerous roads. How are the bus stops when you get there? Well, it depends on whether or not it has this kind of quality of shade around it. So this is a picture that we took in July of the bus stop at Broad and Robinson. Here we can see that under the shade, this very big and really satisfying structured shade. It was about 88 degrees to the touch down there. The same surface just a few feet away was 109. And then that black asphalt is the hottest here at 112. So structured shade does by far the best at providing the kind of maximum cooling that we've seen so far in these pictures. At the same time, also just across the street here on the eastbound side at Broad and Robinson, we have the building itself. This is a former bank, or it is still a bank, Bank of America, that actually casts shade. Again, here, this is that principle of the height of the building and the width of the road. That here is such that building is just high enough to provide a pretty substantial shade that covers this particular stop. It doesn't do anything to do about the rain or wind or snow or anything like that, but this does at least provide some building shade where the road is 113 and here the bench is sitting around 90 degrees. Now, we also went down along by Willow Lawn. This shows the impact of just one small little shade tree. This tiny shade tree, the sidewalk underneath that shade in the darker color was about 89 degrees, whereas the sidewalk was 107 and the road was even hotter. So when we think about kind of making investments in some alternative types of shade, we can not only provide structure, its own structure, or we can build higher along those major corridors, or we can do things like adding greenery, providing natural air conditioning. Now, outside of the shade, we see that bus stops can get very, very hot. As you know, you heard from the rider's voice in that clip that Faith shared at the beginning. But here, both the sidewalk and the bench is 114 degrees in the direct sunlight. So that would be very uncomfortable to sit on. to begin with. Now, we also went out to the Broad Street and Willow Lawn stop, and you can see here that this is an example of a stop that doesn't have natural shade really in any way, but just a short walk away, there are some bushes, and we came upon some riders that were really congregating underneath that bush. And by looking at this heat picture, you can see why. Right by the bus stop is about 108 degrees on the surface to about 90 degrees underneath that tree. So this natural air conditioning is something that people really desire as part of that. And so when we look at where the GRTC on the right here is going to be doing some new installations and updates to their stops versus on the left is like the intensity of the heat wave data at particular GRTC stops, there are some overlaps here, which is encouraging. But what I would kind of suggest is to actually start incorporating the heat data and the quality of the stop and shade availability through all those different things that we just went through as a prioritization strategy to alongside ridership data to advance these kinds of decisions. So here are some that are going to be getting a new shelter in the near future. Laburnum and Seven Gables is going to get a new bench, so we're going to, or a new shelter, so we're going to be able to assess this temperature change. This also shows that the temperatures of a car where the engine is and all the brakes and everything can be 150 degrees. That would be dangerous to touch. Also out here at 25th and S, this is another fully exposed stop, is going to have a new shelter, which will be really exciting. So I want to say that this is really just the beginning of this conversation. I'm looking forward to working with RVA Rapid Transit over the next couple of years to document these things, but also to figure out, like, how would we optimize from an advocacy standpoint where we want to put shelters? Is, where are the most uncomfortable high ridership places? That may allow us to make those kinds of decisions in a really efficient and just way. So to wrap up here, I know I went a little bit over, and I apologize. We'll still have a little bit of time to discuss this presentation, but again, public transportation is vital to achieving our climate goals. Like, there is no future where we continue to rely on car-centric land use and transportation that gets us to the kinds of goals that keep us below or at 1.5 degrees Celsius global warming. So this is transforming our transportation system to having reliable, frequent, and efficient public transit is vital to achieving these climate goals. Now, also, this can have an added benefit of providing needed cooling for riders through shading, and also that additional benefit of protection from the things that might be dangerous, including extreme rainfall events and extreme cold events, even though those are far fewer in frequency in the present day. So I hope this was a good introduction for you into how public transit, especially around buses and bus stops, overlaps with the questions of climate change and the disproportionate impacts on the communities that rely the most on those public transportation systems in the present. So thanks very much. You can find me again on social media through that handle, and you can email me at the Science Museum website or at the sciencemuseum.org address that I put there. So thank you very much for the invitation, Richard and Faith, and I think we're going to facilitate a question and answer session.
Yes. So we're going to get started with some question and answers. Kali already put a question earlier on in the chat, so I encourage you to start putting your questions in the chat right now. So she says, if someone, they them said, if someone isn't already utilizing public transit, alternative transit, and they also don't really care about climate change, why or would they change their actions on hearing your presentation today?
Interesting. If someone isn't already utilizing public transit and they also don't really care about climate change, I don't think that they're going to change their actions, quite frankly. That dismissive portion of the population is getting smaller and smaller and smaller, and the amount of people that are alarmed and cautious or concerned about climate change has grown significantly. So there are fewer and fewer of those perspectives of very dismissive about climate change. And so I actually tend to focus my attention on the people that are alarmed or really concerned about climate change. Those are the sorts of folks that we can start inspiring to take those sorts of actions. whether it be something like a meatless Monday. Americans, especially wealthier, whiter Americans, tend to eat a lot more high carbon rich kinds of foods like red meats. And so by even just reducing and changing the way that they think about food on a daily basis, then maybe they start thinking about these other high carbon intensity things that they do, such as driving. I found that, even just taking and recommending or to invite people that work with me at the Science Museum to do something that is an active or public transportation related thing, like, hey, let's take the Pulse downtown instead of driving, or let's take our bikes and I can show you the kind of way. It's sometimes people just need a little bit of encouragement and support to make that change, because ultimately what I think is underneath that question is like, it's really wealthier people that are tend to be that kind of more dismissive of the approaches that are necessary for climate change, and especially around, in Richmond, public transportation. So I hear that question, but there are sometimes those same approaches will work across the kind of spectrum of concern. But most of the time it's just about supporting people to make those healthier and better choices for the environment.
And Sam has a similar question. How do you explain to skeptics these high surface temperatures are a problem? How do they impact human health, or more that a nuisance dissuades people from taking public transportation?
I certainly think that the uncomfortability of the experience of public transportation certainly reduces the likelihood of someone to choose that form of transportation over another, especially if they own and have access to a private vehicle. So for sure, I think that those high surface temperatures and really being outside when it's really, really hot here, is an uncomfortable experience. So how do you make that experience more comfortable in order to make use of the public transportation system? But then also the how do they impact human health? Well, we're talking about places that have those higher temperatures tend to have higher surface temperatures. So this is directly related to exposure to extreme heat. So if, say, for example, you miss a bus and you're out in the heat for an hour, if it's an hour frequency bus, then you are being exposed to those elevated outdoor temperatures for that entire time. And that the longer you, especially someone that might have a chronic illness, might be, diabetic, might be dehydrated, something like that, that can be the difference between having an acute response to that heat and, not. So that is directly related to our, to the public health implications of extreme heat, simply through that question of exposure. I think there was one other, how do you explain to skeptics that these are a problem? Again, I feel like everybody is like, that there's way more interaction with skeptical folks in this audience than I'm used to. Simply because these sorts of public health implications of these things are strong enough usually when they're presented with it. But talking about things other than public health, you can talk about energy use, energy burden. You can talk about energy poverty, the decision to either pay your air conditioning or even be able to have air conditioning. There's like those sorts of things that certainly can start to push people towards a understanding how this might relate to upward economic mobility writ large. These places that have higher surface temperatures tend to also have lower incomes and tend to experience more energy poverty. So by alleviating this, we alleviate poverty, or at least seek to alleviate that. So yeah, there's a couple of different, I hope that at least some ways gives some insight into that question.
Well, Barry has a good question. Has there been any studies on the materials used on our stops, recycled plastic chairs instead of metal benches, to maximize cooling while also reducing the costs for shelters and benches?
There hasn't, as to my knowledge, I haven't seen any studies on our stops specifically. This is actually kind of the first time that we're formally, kind of trying to do some sort of like census around how hot these places are and the quality of the shade and that sort of stuff. But as far as the surfaces go, I'm not aware of much. However, there are several cities around the country, mostly in the Southwest, like Los Angeles and Phoenix, that are making use of very highly reflective paints on structures and on roads to actually serve as a reflective surface for the sun's energy, thereby lowering the surface temperatures. I will say that there was a teen involved in a program at Augusta County Schools that we did. It was called Throwing Solar Shade, where we were kind of talking about the overlaps of renewable energy and extreme heat. And the student painted a parking space in that high school's parking lot, because as you know, schools tend to have very large surface parking lots, and so they're usually heat islands, that they tested a bunch of different colors of paint and layers of paint. And so there are some inklings toward that being a worthwhile approach. I would say that many of our bus stops are very dark metal, very dark colored, and so that one decision could have a pretty substantial impact on the surface temperatures of those things. But I don't know what that would mean for the quality of the shade inside, or the temperature of inside of a shelter. But it would stand to reason that a lighter colored exterior would lower the interior temperature if it was more like closed off and enclosed.
Yeah. Well, wow. Great information today. Thank you so much for joining us. Kali, I will get this question. Where's your data with the population who do care about climate change is getting larger? So what we can do, Kali, I will email you Jeremy's information, and maybe you guys can follow up with that question on that data question. But we definitely have to wrap up. What a great conversation. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. I do want to give you guys a heads up on our next transit talk. Up there, he dropped it in the chat for you. So thank you, Jeremy, for being on top of that. So our next transit talk will take place September 22nd. And we're inviting GRTC, so Tim Barham, Chief of Transit Operations, and Mike Frontero, Director of Communications. We'll be talking about the path to expansion and the bus operator shortage. So definitely, it will be a challenge to expand regional transportation in the region if we do not have operators. So that's going to be a great conversation. We invite you to go ahead and register for that. Also, I want to say thank you so much again for joining us. Support transit by using public transportation. So ride the bus, y'all. The bus is absolutely free. So not only are you helping the environment right now, you can also save money in your pockets. Gas is very expensive. So we encourage you to use public transportation. Also, you can assist us and take action by adopting a bus stop. Right now, there is not much dedicated funding to cleaning transit stops in our region. And so we have an Adopt a Stop program. You can reach out to myself or Richard if you want more information. Also, we encourage you to share your story. So if you have a story of about heat impact, of how climate is affecting you, especially if you are a bus rider, but also Jeremy has some opportunities for you to share your experiences as well. Please reach out to us, or please reach out to Jeremy. He's dropped his information there. And also lastly, donate. Support helps us do opportunities like this, sharing transit information for the Richmond region. So with that, it's 12:59. Thank you so much for joining us for Transit Talk today. Again, thank you to Dr. Jeremy Hoffman for the wonderful presentation today. We will be posting this recording up on our YouTube page, so you can come back and take a look, but also share it with others. Thank you so much, and we'll see you next time. Have a good one. Bye-bye.